Thank you. Now we're going to move to panel discussion. If I could ask my colleagues who were previously up here to come up, I'll stand up so that there's sufficient chairs. And again, the microphone is open. Deb, before we get to you, let me ask one of the questions that came in over the from the internet viewing. I think we got enough room up there now. We do. So, Andrew, as you're getting settled, the question was first addressed to you, but I think that Steve Goodman and some others in the room might even have a comment. It said that Dr. Vickers, you noted that the authors of the majority of POLS papers where they agree to share as a requirement, they actually fail to share. So when you published your paper that pointed out that the journal was not compliant with its own policies, what happened? Was there any effort or discussion around the enforcement piece of it? And maybe we can get Dr. Goodman's perspective as a journal editor as well.
I guess the question is, did PLOS Medicine change?
Did they do anything about it?
Did they do anything about it? Well, other than trying not to publish our piece for quite some time. I don't believe so, no. And actually part of the problem I had with PLOS is that they felt it was a kind of, I was trying not to be antagonistic towards PLOS. This really wasn't about PLOS. This was really about the authors, and they felt very, very defensive about it. I don't believe anything has changed, and I think it illustrates a more general problem rather than anything specific that PLOS is doing wrong.
Steve, a discussion at the Annals of Internal Medicine, you said that you're afraid that you'll lose your authors. Is that sort of as far as the conversation goes?
Pretty much. We don't have any, and I don't know that I can speak for every conversation that the editors have had, but I'm pretty sure we have no recourse or enforcement for bad behavior, nor do we necessarily even have a way to find it out. I mean, that's actually what we were in the conversations I was having yesterday with the editors in anticipation of this, discussing. But it's a very, very tricky area for a journal to be playing, sort of cop for behavior after the fact. And again, if journals were to play any role here, they'd all have to have some common set of behaviors and sanctions to do that.
Can I ask a quick related question? In policing clinicaltrials.gov registration before publication, has that been, do journals like do
that? Deb, do you want to answer that, Deb,
yes,
or maybe help out?
Journals do that quite a bit, and in 2005, right after the policy was implemented, we watched and in fact at a DIA meeting, it went from 1 year where everyone was complaining about the policy to the next year. The buzz was, New England Journal and JAMA just rejected our manuscript and the whole room changed. But recently the estimate has been about a few hundred papers per year get rejected by the three U.S. journals that are in ICMJE, New England Journal, JAMA, and Annals of Internal Medicine. But the latest estimate was 9,000. That was published by somebody recently. So they do, and in fact, I get copies from at least Partners and Yale send memos out to their investigators every year that say, at Yale last year, I think it was 40-ish, 40 of our investigators were rejected, you guys really better register. And each rejection has a huge social impact, I would say.
Yeah, but I just want to underscore the fact that it takes all the journals working together and working together with you. No one journal could do this.
And Steve, it took some people, and it wasn't us for a change, but it was some other people outing the journals that were letting trials slip through. So in the early years, there were some people writing articles saying, X journal in the 12 main ICMJE members let their favorite trials slip through. So it takes constant vigilance.
Right, but I also want to point out that's actions that the journals have that's under their control. With respect to the data sharing, it's actions of the investigators that is completely independent of the journal control. So it's a bit of a problem.
So along that question, Miles, somebody specifically, the person who asked Andrew about the enforcement, they said, yesterday the Nature editor didn't mention this. Do you want to have an opportunity to comment on the data sharing enforcement piece?
Yeah, I mean, we can't go faster than the community, but we go a little faster than the community. So Nature Genetics, we have a checklist before we send a paper to review. We go through sources of data, whether there's a unique accession, whether it's live, whether it's available to the referees. That's very important. We let the authors know that this is a community requirement for certain areas, expression data, exome data, genome data, etc. Genome-wide association studies have been the exception, essentially because they're legacy cohorts which have been collected under particular IRBs. The individual level data have not been available to reviewers, have not been available, but there's been successful reuse by the consortia. So I think effectively what was just described by Dr. Briggs, that a lot of the data use arrangements are already in place in consortia through a sort of compete, collaborate, compel process. But then the next stage that we get to do enforcement, except in principle, we say your accession or your data sets are not available. Where's the data sharing plan? You know, how are you making this data available? And then accept the paper. And then when it's up there, we get a lot of emails, and it's amazing how much data sharing happens afterwards. You know, we couldn't get the data sharing plan, or it wasn't where we expected it. An email from the editor, and oh, we got our data. The next sanction is either to have a data access moderation committee, as I mentioned yesterday, and if that fails, you can always put an editorial note on the paper, and nobody wants to see that on their paper because that's, you know, on the road to rejection, to retraction. So there are a number of sanctions. We don't want to use them. We want to use, you know, the community, the current community norms, and those improve with time. We can't get too far ahead of our communities.
Thanks. Okay, Deb?
Hi, I had a couple of comments on Steve, and then Josie brought up one of these points. First, for the ID for the data set, I would offer a plea that if it's a clinical trial, use the NCT number, which is the unique identifier that you get in clinicaltrials.gov, which has currently a lot of utility. First of all, you can throw it into Google and you'll get everything, but it's indexed in Medline, and so it links through to everything. And it would be much better, rather than adding a new ID to the whole system, to use that. So I would like to make that plea. Second, in terms of protocols, let me just say a few things. Places like New England Journal have protocols for many of their articles. They're not, well, it still involves trust. They're not date stamped so that there's a date on them, but you don't know if they changed for example, the outcome measure the night before, or in Steve's anecdote, if the person who wrote the protocol the night before, you know, made it so poof, obviously the outcome measures are going to be coordinated. One thing that will happen when proposed rulemaking is done, there will be time for public comment about the clinicaltrials.gov submission requirements. And one thing that HHS was directed to consider is whether or not submission of the protocol as a PDF would be required. And if so, when, at the beginning, at the end, both times, whatever. And that raises the question about what is a protocol. Industry has a lot of guidance about what has to be in a protocol. Non-industry has little to no guidance. And so those are areas where we'll need everyone in this room to comment. I don't know what the right answers are, but it'll be important to get comment from both the academic and the industry communities on that. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, certainly one of the key things that's emerged through the last day and a half is that, and that we've not talked a lot about, is what's going to be the education and training that goes into to this whole piece. Because the comments that, well, you know, I didn't have a protocol or I'm still writing it, I mean, reflects a general lack of understanding of the clinical research process, and we as academics need to do a much better job about that.
And there's one area of great disagreement that somehow isn't brought out, which is when you need to have your statistical analysis plan. There are many opinion leaders, I'd say, who think it's okay to do it after the data are already collected but before they're unblinded, and others who just shudder at that thought. but there needs to be a discussion of that as well.
Yeah, discussion and training, and then there are public perception issues, as someone
Right.
pointed out yesterday, that industry-sponsored trials have a different view in the community, and yet the quality may actually be higher for some of the reasons that you've spoken about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just
go
one
ahead,
comment on the ID. I think this is a very tricky area. The NCD is great, but the problem is some of the richest data sets come from ongoing cohort studies, which are not registered in clinicaltrials.gov, and we don't want to be in a situation where we have different formats for these IDs depending on what the design is or where it came from. In some of these cohort studies, they've embedded clinical trials, very complicated. So whatever we do, we don't want to reinvent that wheel, but we have to develop an ID that works for everybody.
So Sharon had asked us to sort of talk about the elephants in the room, and one of them seems to be this cavernous gap between well-intentioned policies and compliance with those policies in a number of areas, in the publishing area and the funding area. So there are some positive steps, I think, that could be considered. We've talked about challenges around academic advancement and sort of the models for that. One of the things that follows in addition to publications is funding. And so I think from the funder's perspective, you've provided a lot of good tools and policies about data sharing, which are being adopted, I think, in a variable way. Are there opportunities to sort of provide positives incentives, in other words, for people who are applying for new grants, considering track record in data sharing as a large chunk of the scoring in funding some of these proposals? That's one point. The second quick point, I had a question for Dr. Eichler. From the FDA perspective, the reason that we don't release subject level data is because we're prohibited from doing that by statute and regulation, and if we do, we get sued, and it has happened in the past. So that's sort of a legal barrier that we're left with. But Dr. Eichler, you had mentioned that you would be releasing full clinical data sets from both products that were approved and were not approved. It's the sort of the failed trials release that I had a question about. Are you running into individual country IP legal problems with that issue?
Okay, failed applications. I'm not talking failed trials. I can only talk about failed applications. So company X comes to us for a license application, we turn it down, or, which happens usually 5 minutes before 12, they would withdraw the application. Under European legislation, we are obliged to also publish that. So you will find an assessment report on a turned down application. Now, logic would extend that if that is in the public domain, and we say that clinical trials are not commercial confidential, that I see it happen, that there will be a request. Also, give us data on turned down applications. So it's not at the level of the trial, it's at the level of the marketing authorization application. Does that answer the question? Yes. The other point related to that is how much resources you have to spend. I mean, from the FDA's perspective, even if we were able to share data and put it in a form, there's a process that has to be gone through to redact, trade secret information, patient, which is hugely labor intensive and really diverts from sort of the main focus of reviewing regulatory applications. I can absolutely see what you're talking about. We are having the same problem. The current situation, what we call reactive. So you say to us, could we please have the data? And then that's reactive. We react to that by giving you the data. And that is a nightmare, because presently we also have to go through that. There isn't the idea is not about commercial confidential, because in a clinical, we're talking clinical data here. We're not talking about the pharmaceutical thing. That's commercial confidential, but that was never been an issue. So clinical, we're not looking for commercial confidential. What we still have to do is the personal data. And as I say, we want to get rid of that. We want to make it a process that is not resource intensive for us, and therefore we want to be proactive. So it's on our website. You comply with condition A, B, and C. You click on it, you have it, and it should not involve any work for us. That's why we want to make sure that from day one the data sets don't have any patient identifiable information in there. So that's the vision. When we will live up to that vision, well, future will tell.
We have a comment over here,
I ju-
and then we'll go to you, Andrew.
Sorry. I just want to put that in perspective from the other side of the receiving end of EMA documents and some basic statistics and timelines. Again, the Reuters report that I showed you showed that they've released 1.5 million pages in 18 months. In our particular case of Tamiflu, it's 25,000 pages, unredacted, no redactions. So just to give you a sense of work involved, effort, and all that, I mean, some statistics put out there.
Yeah, on this point of personal data, my own view is that if there is no personal data, it was just the some ID number and their pain scores at the end of the trial, I think that should be totally fully open access. I don't think that we have to do the work to de-identify data, to take out personal information at all. I think that what we have to make sure is that if there is personal information, it only goes to certain individuals who have a duty of care. So if, for example, you're an academic and you have some question about the Tamiflu data or whatever, and you want that we can go through some process where we're saying that it's legitimate for somebody to look at this data, that they won't breach any confidentiality. Then I do not understand why we have to spend huge amounts of money deleting the names of individuals. This is a huge. I'm involved in it the whole time. I work with Swedish colleagues. In our collaboration, the Swedes can see that Niels Olsson died in 1991 of prostate cancer, and I can't, and I don't understand. We're part of the same research team. I have no personal interest in these men any more than my Swedish colleagues do. But because it's being transferred between different institutions, then there's this whole heavyweight regulation in the NHS. When I was in England, and I don't know there was this idea of a duty of care, which is within the national health system. You can get any personal information you like, right, as long as there's a good reason for it, and you have a duty of care not to abuse that. I don't see why we don't have the same situation for redaction and so on and so forth here.
Dr. Eichler?
Just a nuance on that. I fully agree. I mean, normally a clinical data set will not have the names in it anyway. Why would you? No one needs that. The argument that is usually brought forward is you have a condition that is an ultra-rare orphan setting. There are just 2 patients with that disease in the whole of France. One is 75 years old, the other 25. Can you identify them? Yes, in theory you can. Whether that is relevant in practice is a different matter. For a drug like Tamiflu, probably is not. So we'll probably have to address that, but there will be a way out. I don't see that as a stumbling block.
Hi, I'm Joe Ross from Yale. I just wanted to thank this great series of talks this morning. This question is directed to Dr. Briggs. I totally agree. The NHLBI BioLink website is fantastic. I've used it before. We've published papers off of it. It's been up for at least 3 years and very active, if not longer. That's how long I've been aware of it. What's slowing down the other NIH institutes from getting their big trials posted?
Well, I can't fully answer that. NIDDK has also established a data repository. It's actually older than that, although it doesn't have quite as strong electronic resources. In NCAM, we have provided funding to the major trials that we support, but they are relatively small in number, and we actually hopefully make the data sets available by paying the coordinating center to continue to put those data sets, and I happen to know that GEMS and GATE and a couple of the other large trials are in fact available data sets. I think that there is a variety of things that leads to hesitation. One is a sense of all the hesitations, Dr. Vickers went through them very articulately, that the investigator communities have. So certainly one caution that NIH program staff feel is not moving ahead of the community opinion. But another, frankly, is resources. And the BioLink is expensive, and I was discussing it last week with Susan Shuren, and she said, in fact, the most effective uses of these data sets are usually done in collaboration. A number of the Common Fund activities do make data sharing a very prominent part of the expectations. I'm also one of the leaders of a new initiative that was discussed yesterday that Rob Califf is heading to fund a set of pragmatic trials using healthcare system partnerships. And certainly in the solicitation for that, we made data sharing a very prominent component of the original application. So it's a culture change, and we have an NIH culture as well, and being very activist in setting expectations is something that's very much in the culture of some of the institutes and centers, and perhaps a little less so in others.
Terrific. Thanks.
Some of them are grants and some of them are contracts. Certainly setting data sharing expectations can be an appropriate part of a notice grant award, and so I don't actually view that as an important determinant of the difference.
Yes. My question's for Dr. Eichler. Assuming the EU goes forward and does in fact release a large corpus of data, in your estimation, will that in fact render about 90% of our discussion here today irrelevant? And I'm curious if you could comment on that.
Not 95, but probably 50%. Yeah, well, look, what are we talking about? We are only talking about clinical trials data or observational data in relation to a drug that is being submitted for a license application, or that is on the market and is undergoing relicensing, whatever. So anything that academia does, for example, in prostate cancer or surgery or so, is unaffected by that. So my first answer is, yeah, about 50%. My second is, will it set a standard? Probably yes.
Dr. Woodcock, did you want to grab a microphone and respond?
Georg, though, generally you don't have the individual patient level data. So we're talking about release of summary data primarily.
Okay.
They don't have it.
Wait, we have it in a paper format. We will change that. We will get the full set.
I'll tell you, can I speak from my experience? They have it and they don't have it. We received that 8,545 pages was one of the 24 or so trials we requested. That one, they had it. The rest, they didn't.
So we're talking the future here. We will get it. We will request it from the industry. We will request it in a format that is individual, patient identifiable, sort of cleansed of that. And that will be it.
At the microphone.
Hi, Mike Watson from the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics and a member of the Genomics Roundtable. I think that last comment highlights our problem is we pay for all this information in personal medical records and we're unable to access it. And I'm not worried about the eMERGE study and the difficulties in that. There are actually other ways to get to the point of care and access clinical information. I direct NICHD's Newborn Screening Translational Research Network, where we have, as the coordinating center, we have our own sharing policies, but the individual grantees that operate in our system are obligated to write a sharing policy in their grant, as was mentioned. Too many of them say that we are going to give each other a password and share our data among our work group, and that's what gets through the review process. So I think much more robust kinds of sharing policies are going to be needed, really, to ensure access to the kind of data that at least publications have been based on. I want to expand a little bit on what Dr. Kozel said, which is she touched the very tip of an iceberg with Williams syndrome. We're talking 5,000 to 7,000 or so such diseases, and they don't all have a Williams syndrome support group that encourages the sharing of data and brings it together. So we have an enormous problem. And I think even if you found your 250 hypertensive patients out on the street, and then you went to look at their genetic etiologies, you'd find very few of each of the different forms of getting there and have the exact same problem. So I think we need to face the paradigm shift that genomics is bringing us and really look at how we access this data at a vast population level. Our clinical trials right now are to establish the clinical history of the disease, and then hopefully clinical interventions, not drug interventions. So I think we've got a long way to go to build the system that's actually going to work for where the genomics paradigm is taking us.
Dr. Kozel, do you want to comment?
I think I just agree with everything that you've said.
That's a relief.
Next at the microphone.
Yeah, hi, Jesse Berlin from Janssen. I have a question, but I was struck by a couple of comments in this discussion. One is with respect to protocols and what goes in a protocol. Steve, you may know that there's the SPIRIT checklist. There's been a working group that's taken a little long to come to fruition, but there's a publication coming out soon, just accepted for publication. The checklist will be in the Annals, and the explanation will be in the BMJ. SPIRIT is a group that was convened specifically for developing standards for what belongs in a clinical trial protocol. And it's detailed and explicit, and really speaks to content more than, does the statistical analysis plan go in the protocol or is it a separate document? So it's coming. And one of the purposes is exactly kind of educating people who are unfamiliar with kind of what is a protocol anyway, and the pro part actually being emphasized. And another point that, Steve, you raised, since you mentioned observational studies, I mean a group of us in my department have actually published a commentary in pharmacoepidemiology and drug safety in response to a debate that's been raging in the epidemiology literature about the value or not of registration of observational studies. Where we come out is certainly in instances where you have an established cohort with pre-specified hypotheses and a protocol, where you're doing serious science, that ought to be registered the same way a clinical trial is registered and with results disclosed. So do you want to, if I can keep the microphone and after...
Well, Jesse, we got a long line and we got about 5 minutes left. So let Steve comment on that, and then I'll go to Mike, and we'll try to get people...
I don't want to necessarily interrupt the flow. I'll just say one thing is that the important thing, I think, and this is a complicated issue, is that the data set be registered to have the ID and not a particular trial. So, for example, from the MESA study, there might be 50 different studies, and we could register each one of them. But the important thing is that it's the MESA data set that's being used, and that's a little different than the registration of the studies themselves. So I think that we have to find some way to talk about that.
Mike?
Yeah, Mike Rosenblatt from Merck. My question is for Dr. Briggs. You spoke about the NIH thinking about data sharing, and I think that was very helpful for us to hear. But it occurs to me that one of the themes that we've been hearing about is, before the sharing of the data, the problems of irreproducible data and how big a problem that is. And I'm just wondering, before we share data that may lead to misinformation or mislearning, that as the NIH is the sponsor of so much of this research, you must have concerns about the growing drumbeat and publications about irreproducible data. So could you tell us, are you thinking about that problem as well, and what you're thinking about it?
Well, it has awakened enormous concern, and at least 3 groups have put together meetings talking about this. So there's a meeting of leadership from the Cancer Institute. Last week, there's a group dealing with this issue in NIMH and mental health. And so and Joe Ross's, who is here, paper was recently discussed in great detail at the leadership forum. There are many pieces of this problem. There's the problem that was talked about a lot last week was also the failures and difficulty in reproducibility of preclinical data. What we're talking about here together in the last day and a half has largely to do with clinical data, and I think that, and perhaps to stand back, some of the spur for data sharing came from a very simple kind of data, namely genomic data. Now, genomic data comes with 4 letters, right? And we actually know a lot about the error rate in sequencing data. When we talk about the more complex types of data that we're talking about here today, the quality of data becomes a much bigger problem. How do you even measure the quality of data? I'm a believer in transparency, and I think what's being talked about here is only part of the fix for the problems of reproducibility. But certainly the NIH leadership has been paying intense attention to these issues, and it's been a subject of enormous concern to all of us.
So let's go with, and I'm going to apologize, one more question, and then we do have another 15-minute question and answer period that we can come back to, and I think most of these folks will still be here. So let's go one more.
Hi, Michael Cantor from Pfizer. This is for Dr. Goodman. When you were showing the policies of the other journals, you noted that Science, Nature, and PNAS have all those policies in place and they're actually able to enforce people to submit their data, whereas the medical journals don't. And you noted that you can't really enforce that because people will submit to other journals. So how do you learn from the earth sciences or the hard sciences over to the clinical journals to kind of have a parallel, I would say a set of rules so that you can increase participation and get people to submit better? Is there something different between the two fields?
I'm not a sociologist, and they are quite different for many of the reasons that have been brought up. I would say that it's absolutely critical within, and we heard a lot about the community, and within the genomics community, obviously what they give up, they also get back, and that hasn't been, and that was actually the theme of the meeting of funders, that they have to develop a culture where the sense is that even though you're giving up something, you're getting back just as much, in that you will have access to these collected data sets as well. I think it's a little bit too complex for me to, I can't, it has to do with academic incentives, it has to do with regulatory, it has to do with a lot of things that have to come together to force collective action. It has to be both push and pull. It can't just be forcing people to do something. I do think that it has to do with the community understanding that it has a lot to get out of it other than just punishment if they don't follow the rules. And I think a lot of comments here have talked about ways to get there, but it's going to take all the interested forces to be working collectively, developing metrics for, I love the comment about the NIH giving credit for data sharing. That would be part of the solution. Promotion, part of the solution, and many of the things that have been said here, but I don't want to cut short Janet's.
Janet,
please.
It has to be very quick.
We have 159 million lives in our Sentinel network now. So people are talking about observational studies. We're definitely willing. We've been going out begging people to figure out how to share this national resource to allow other studies to be done on this network. So that is a model that is for the existing healthcare data that is highly valuable and has a huge number of, but everybody wants to do their own thing and nobody wants to join together. It's probably what you've been talking about all morning.
And we can come back when you join the panel at noon to further that discussion. Well, let me thank the panel and take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back and get started.